I'm on the wall one.
Me too.
You gotta go upstairs.
I'm registered.
Yeah, but that's a long 4 months. It's like one of the highest floors.
You're good with it, right?
Okay, so let's go on with our discussion of event studies today. The general idea of an event study is how do we use the movement in stock prices? How do we use the movement in stock prices in response to a particular announcement to extract information about the effect on the value of shareholders of the particular piece of information in question. And it finds three cases of relevance to lawyers. First, the one that you will probably most commonly experience in your careers is the so-called single firm event study, which is what you're doing when you're trying to figure out what is the impact, whether a false and misleading disclosure, quote, fraud, what is the impact of that disclosure? What are the damages associated with that false and misleading disclosure? So basically, if you think about it, what you're trying to do is typically, let's have a timeline. Time one, the firm Enron announces earnings of $10 a share. Enron is not a good example, but any firm announces earnings of a certain amount. The stock price after the announcement is trading at 50. Some months later, or some period later, the accountants show up, and or maybe there's a whistleblower, and basically it's revealed that the $10 a share is overstated. The true earnings for that period were, say, $6 a share. So there is corrective disclosure. And the stock price falls from 50 to 35. So, in effect, a significant part of the litigation is a single firm event study, trying to extract from the observed facts of an initial price, disclosure, final price, something about the impact on shareholder welfare of the false and misleading disclosure, so you can assert what the damages are and attempt to recover them from the parties who are responsible for the false and misleading disclosure, right? So that's one common way in which lawyers encounter event studies, but it's a single firm event study. And for reasons which probably are by now intuitively familiar, probably the reliability of it is open to question, if only because of the issues of statistical significance, which are very severe in the case of a single firm, right? We'll come back more in a minute. The second scenario in which you will encounter event studies is the one that we have been that you saw in the Bradley, Desai, and Kim study, and which we will use throughout the course, which is to say, to look at the impact of a similar event on a broad group of firms to try to determine the effects on shareholder welfare of the event in question. So in connection with the Allied Signal study, which again is a single firm event study, what I said is one way we might think of a broader use of this is to try to figure out whether when boards fired CEOs, whether they were responding out of a judicious determination as to whether the CEO was doing a good job, or whether the boards were responding out of some kind of panic because of maybe a bad analyst report that was not connected to actual performance, but the board just thought it had to do something to quell the public unease. And so, as a method, we would collect a portfolio of firms where the board fired the CEO, and we would determine the average stock price reaction in response to such an event, and then we would be able to make, in effect, a general statement about what boards in average were doing when they fired the CEO, right? So in other words, one way that we see event studies is a way to collect evidence on an important piece of management or other party behavior relevant to how firms are run. All right? So that's the second way in which the event studies play a role for us. The third way in which you will see event studies used is to try to evaluate the impact of a new statute or a new SEC reg. So, for example, there are a lot of event studies associated with the enactment of Sarbanes-Oxley, with different people taking different sides of the question as to whether this new set of rules requiring internal controls, higher standards for audit committees, etc., was a good thing or a bad thing for the shareholders. And the various methods are an effort to look at stock price change across the broad swath of firms upon announcement of the Sarbanes-Oxley enactment to determine if enactment increased or decreased shareholder value. So right. So those are the general ways the methodology is used. So from the general account, let me move to a little more detail as to how it's done. So the first step is for a single firm, in the case of a single firm event study, or for each firm in the portfolio of firms, the effect of which you're trying to analyze, we determine first the return, which is the price on day one minus the price on the day before day one, P0, divided by the P0 price. But that's the return. And what we need to figure out is something called the abnormal return. Well, what does that mean? What we know is that, without getting too scientific about it, surely every firm in the marketplace is going to be affected, the stock price of every firm is going to be affected in some way by general market movements. So at the very least, we need to abstract market movements associated with that firm over the days in which we're collecting evidence of the abnormal return. Now, the simplest way to do this, and often it's done kind of as a rough and ready way, is to generate what's called, in effect, net of market returns. And often when you're trying to figure out the effect of a merger announcement on the welfare of the shareholders of the target versus those of the acquirer, it's enough to do this net of market adjustment, which is, and what does that mean? In effect, if the return for a given stock on the day under examination is, say, a plus 5%, but the market as a whole, the S&P, goes up by 2%, then we'll say that the abnormal return was 3%. Right? Just what we're doing is just adjusting for the predictable effect on the stock price of movements in the market as a whole. Now, there are more sophisticated ways. Yeah, Jacob.
Do you ever adjust for the beta of the company? For example, if you had a company with a negative beta and the market goes up and the stock of the firm goes up, that would actually be even a more abnormal effect.
The stock, I mean, it'll be rare that a firm will have a negative beta. I'm going to get to beta in a minute, right? So the point is, implicitly, when we just subtract out the market return, we're assuming the firm is beta of 1, right? That it's that it will its stock would predictably move by the same percentage on a given day that the market as a whole is going to move, right? But as we've discussed, we might want to be more sophisticated than that, because what we've learned is that the stock price of some firms, the stock returns of some firms, will move more sharply than the market as a whole. An airline firm, if the market goes up by 2%, then predictably we would expect the airline stock to go up by 3%, let's say, if it has a beta of 1.5. Or maybe the stock price is more stable than the market as a whole, a grocery store. And as I've said, the predicted movement of the stock price relative to the market as a whole relates to the underlying business of the firm. Whether we would expect a good or bad sign to have a sharp effect or a muted effect on the expected future earnings of the firm. Airline stock, yes. Grocery store, not so much. All right, now, where does the beta come from? So, financial economists, I mean, they merely observe things. So here's the return on the stock. Here's the return on the market. There'll be, points from prior days when they just observe stock price change, market change. There will be points, and then, somebody will come up with a so-called regression line that tries to give a best fit for the relationship between the stock price change and the market change for that firm. And so you, in effect, subtract that out, that predictable element of the market movement for that firm, to produce the abnormal return. There's a further refinement here, which I'll drop as a footnote. As the methodologies developed, people have said, wait a minute, let me, better way to motivate it. All right, so there will be we're trying to predict the return of a stock on a given day, right? And the return on a stock on a given day, or the stock price change on a given day, is going to be a function of the movement in the market and the so-called beta, and a lot of other factors, noise, error, random things affecting the firm which are not captured in the overall market movement. That's the point. For any given day, there are going to be a lot of other factors that are going to affect a given stock, a particular stock, other than the market price. And what we've observed is these random factors are noise. And the more noise, that is to say, the more the stock price kind of fluctuates, the harder it will be to determine that a given stock price change is a, quote, signal, meaning it will have statistical significance. So if there's a lot of, noise around the stock price, then, that means that it will take a very large stock price change indeed, a very large return indeed, to be able to say that the event in question, which was announced on that day, is related to a stock price change that leads us to believe that the event had a measurable impact on the stock price. So the Allied Signal firing of the CEO was that rare case where the effect on the stock price was so great that notwithstanding the noise associated with Allied Signal, it was very clear that this the stock price change was statistically significant. It was not just noise; it was a signal in the the technical sense. Right? Everybody with me thus far? All right. So. That means that there might be a lot of events, a lot of announcements, a lot of events, which you think would have meaningful impact on shareholder value, but because there's so much noise associated with the stock price movement in general, that you can't make such a conclusion. Now, how do you get an instrument that's more refined? How do you get a testing methodology that is more refined? So, two different scenarios I want to describe. The first is the single firm event study. And this is really important because many of you will be will be involved in the litigation of securities cases, right? Fraud, for which I'm saying the single firm event study will be an important part of the case in chief. And you're going to be stuck with the fact that there's a lot of noise that's going to be hard for you to say that the stock price change was statistically significant, and thus if you're plaintiff that you can make out a case in chief that the information disclosure had impact for your client. So, what you will see are efforts to come up with more precise, what's called asset pricing models, to estimate the stock price change for a given firm on a given day. And they do a ton of this across the street at the business school. In other words, we've come up in our discussion with a very crude way to predict a firm's stock price change, its return on a given day. We've limited it to the change in the market as a whole. And for what we do, that has a value that is, that's very real. But if you're going to do litigation, you're going to want a methodology that's more precise. So what you will commonly see are efforts to come up with asset pricing models, they're called, that entail more variables than just the movement on the market as a whole. And think about this intuitively, right? If Allied Signal is in, a technology stock, let's say, or let me think about a better example. Suppose there's an event involving Intel, the semiconductor maker. So, high beta stock probably, and there's some allegation of fraud. So, what you might want to do if you're trying to develop your case is, in effect, drill down below the index for the market movement of all firms to an index, a sub-index that relates to technology firms only. And And so the sort of the cutting edge of sophistication here is in effect to try to classify the defendant firm, to classify Intel as part of a sub-index, and thus be able to use that index as your predictive tool to generate the abnormal returns. And so therefore, and I'm going to stop at this level, if you see something called Fama-French sub-index in an event study setup, what you'll understand is that there is an effort to break down the market movement of that firm, not just vis-a-vis the market as a whole, but vis-a-vis, in a more refined way, similar firms that ought to respond in a similar way to the market movement, so to be able to better define what is an abnormal return for that firm on that day, right? If all the firms that make semiconductors, they're going to be responding in a similar way in response to general developments. And so, in effect, if you could subtract out that from the return you happen to see for Intel on that day, you'll have a better idea about the abnormal returns. All right? So anyway, this is, I go here, there, the risk of confusion, because for the typical, for most of you who do, I don't know if you're going to do securities fraud stuff, but I'm just saying this is the direction that you would be pushing yourself if you're going to do securities fraud, thinking about how to come up with a more refined version of the event study method, focusing on a better job of abstracting out the abnormal returns. All right. Now, let's refer to the second case, which is to say you're trying to look at a similar event that hits a broad group of firms to determine whether, on average, firms are better off from the firing of the CEO by the board or not, right? Are the shareholders better off? Is the board doing a good job? How do you make your testing mechanism more precise? How do you do a better job? How are you more carefully able to distinguish signal from noise? And the answer is that you collect a portfolio of firms, a group of firms, each of which has faced a similar such event, albeit at a different time. And you compute, in effect, the abnormal return for each of those firms. You average the abnormal return for the portfolio as a whole, and then, precisely because you've done this in a portfolio way, the noise associated with the generation of the return that you've observed, the abnormal return you've identified, tends to cancel out so that signal is identifiable at a lower level of abnormal return for the portfolio as a whole than it would be for any single firm in the portfolio. And so how do we get at that intuition, right? So I mean, one way to get at the intuition is to, here's this picture on, this is figure 3.8. This relates the number of coin flips to standard deviation. And what you see is the more time you flip the coin, even though for every single time there's the chance of a head or a tail, the more times you flip it, if you collect those in the portfolio, the greater the less likely it is that an aberrant result will be just noise. Right? You're trying to figure out if this is a reliable coin. And if you flip it 5 times and it's all heads, the ordinary noise associated with the 5 flips is probably so great that you're unable to say that this abnormal return, which is the abnormal return is 5 times whatever the payoff is, you're unable to say that the abnormal return is statistically significant. But as you increase the number of flips, the standard deviation goes down, which is to say the likelihood that you will get anything other than the 50% return goes down. So again, if you go back and look at some of the way we computed this, the 95% interval of expected results will converge on the 50-50 outcome as the number of flips goes up. So that if you end up with, out of these 100 flips, if you end up with 85 heads, you'll be able to say for sure that the coin is a bad coin. And so it's the same point about noise and signal. If the portfolio, if you have more firms where there's the randomness of the error term, as you have more firms, in effect, the standard deviation will go down so that when you observe the abnormal return outside of the 2 times standard deviation, you'll be able to say, aha, I have a statistically significant result. Anyway, so again, if you go back, when you review, if you go back and look at how we tried to use the 2 standard deviations when we were assessing the riskiness of a stock, it's the same idea when we're trying to determine whether the observed abnormal return is statistically significant. It's the 95% interval in which we get outcomes, or the 99% interval, and if we have a result that is outside of that limit, then we say, in effect, aha, there looks to be news here. This is not just noise, it's observable, it's signal, it's meaningful. All right. So, we'll come back to some general points perhaps at the end. Let's look now at the Bradley, Desai, and Kim study. And let me just get some help here. So, is Henri here? Yes. So, what is this study trying to show? What is the core question that the study is trying to collect evidence on?
I think the point was mostly to determine the synergistic gains and where both the target and the acquiring firm are making money.
Okay, so it is the allocation of gains between the shareholders of target and acquirer, right?
Yes.
The allocation, assuming that there is a surplus from the transaction, how are the gains allocated as between the shareholders of the target and the shareholders of the acquirer? Okay. And that's real important. I mean, this study has some insights in it which are extremely important for lawyers. And we'll try to figure out what those insights are at some point soon. Basically, look at table 6-7 and in effect, describe how this table was generated.
Is it 6-7 or 7-7?
I'm sorry, 7-7. I'm looking at yeah, right. In a different version of this, it was, let me make sure I've got the right table. I'm looking at a slightly different version. Okay. Maybe this is, actually, this is table 7-2. All right, good. This is the third edition. All right, third edition, table 7-2. So, basically, how is this, what do these numbers mean?
Honestly, I have no idea.
No idea. Okay, well, that's a good start. Let's see. Stephen Patrick. So, you're co-counsel here. So, fill us in a little bit as to what the numbers mean. Or let me ask, how do they proceed to do the study?
So I get number of contests. That would be, and then I think the rest of them are the variance.
Well, I mean, I want to come back with a different kind of sort of methodological issue. How would you compute? I mean, if you're told that Pfizer acquired Merck, and you want to know if there was a surplus, the size of the surplus created as a result of that, how would you go about doing that?
I would look at the increase in price of both firms.
Okay, so we look at the stock price change for Pfizer And the stock, this is in percentage terms. The stock price change for Merck, percentage terms. And then what?
Adam?
Or maybe, you know, Merck is not such a good example because Merck is a very big firm. Let's assume they sort of, you know, Bioderm, which is a firm I made up. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a stock price change for Pfizer, a stock price change for Bioderm. How do we determine if surplus has been created?
I guess.
I mean,
have
on the
to
basis of the raw stock price change, we're able to say, did the market think it was a good thing for the shareholders of the acquirer? Did the acquirer's stock price go up? Yes or no? Did the market think it was a good thing for the target? The stock price went up, yes or no? But is that informative as to the ultimate issue or not?
So it has to go up enough so that if it's the smaller firm and then the bigger one has a decrease in stock price, but proportionally you have to just, I guess, depending on the size of the firm and the increase of the stock price.
Stephen is worried about the case. Stephen or Steve?
Stephen.
Stephen. Stephen is concerned about the case in which the merger announcement is made. Bioderm stock price goes up 35%. Pfizer's stock price goes down 1%. And the question is, wait a minute, do we say 34%, whatever that means, or not? How would we actually figure out whether value's been created? What's the step we need?
I guess you can multiply the percent change by the ratio of the size of the total value of the equity.
Well, you would dollarize the stock price change, right?
Oh yeah, that would
Convert
be
it into
easier,
common units like dollars. How would you go about that?
Just the total number of stocks. And
The market cap, the number of shares outstanding times the price per share before the merger was announced, times the stock price change. So you get $1 amount for the acquirer, and you do a similar thing for the target. Plus or minus, plus or minus. You add them together, and you can determine whether in dollar terms there's been a surplus, right? Because the units are dollars now. And a tiny stock price change, a 1% negative on a $100 billion market cap firm like Pfizer, that's a negative $1 billion. And a 35% increase on, a $100 million firm like Bioderm might be $35 million. And so it looks like a massive loss for Pfizer on the numbers I presented. Obviously, that's not quite right. But and so the point I'm making is the way, if you're typically in a scenario, the acquirer is much bigger than the target. You're trying to, and often the acquirer has a negative return. You're trying to determine if the surplus has been created or not. So you got to convert it all to dollars. And the way you do it is the stock price change times market cap of acquirer, stock price change times market cap of the target, and we add them together and we determine if there's a surplus. And And we presumably can determine, in effect, the percent gain for the transaction as a whole by what? We add together the market cap of acquire and target, and then that's in the denominator, and then the numerator will consider the surplus as a whole, right? So that's how we get, that's basically the strategy that was followed in Table 7.2 to generate the figures here. All right, so Stephen, looking at the first set, the combined returns, what does that tell us about M&A activity in the period with respect to whether in the transactions that occurred, value was created for the shareholders?
It stayed really constant in the 3 periods, between 7 and 8.
I mean, finish the sentence. What was the it that remained? Constant.
Oh, I thought it was, percent return, but
Right, that the surplus was created. Right. I mean, in other words, what we learn from the row here is that over this period, the M&A, the transactions that occurred, on average, created between 7 and 8% of extra value relative to the prior value, combined value of bidder and target, right? So is this signal or noise? Can we take this result to the bank, as it were, or not? Do we have any further information revealed in the table about that?
well, the fact that it's so many different transactions, I think, is good evidence that.
It's good evidence, but does the table provide us with any further reason to believe that it's good evidence? What does the footnote tell us?
This footnote that says significantly different from 0 at the 0.01 level.
Okay, so what that means is that the test statistic says that it is statistically significant, right? Because basically, if t equals 2, then rho equals 0.05, which equivalent, meaning statistically significant. If t equals something like 3.5, then rho is equal to 0.1, which is even better. So t equals 2, at the 95% level, rho equals 0.05. If rho is 1, it's statistically significant at the 0.01 level, the 99% level. So that's even more evidence that this is a statistically significant result as to the characteristic, as to the reliability of the average surplus creation in M&A in the relevant periods. All right. So final question with respect to the first row. What is this additional element, percent positive? Why is that there? what added evidence does it provide?
Percent pause. So would that be the percentage of the contests that created a positive increase? And so I guess the more, the greater the percent positive would be, would mean there would be a less variance. Because if you have a lot of negative ones and a lot of positive ones, but the positive ones are more positive, I guess.
Well, the variance is figured out with statistical significance, right? But except you're on, I mean, you've seen the core point. What you're concerned about is that remember, we're dealing with the average return of the portfolio as a whole. You're concerned that this average return might be biased by a few deals, large deals that create a lot of value, whereas many of the smaller deals don't. And some of that disparity between the big deals that tilt the average is going to be picked up by the measure of statistical significance, as Stephen suggested, a further way to, in effect, look at the tendency of the portfolio as a whole with respect to the surplus creation by looking at the percent positive or negative, as the case may be. And so what we see is that over the period, on average, if you look at the far right-hand column, 75% of the deals created a surplus when you looked at putting together the gains to the acquirer, the gains to target, or the losses, respectively. So this is incredibly useful stuff, right? So what it also says, how do you flip the point, right? What does this also say? Tell us. That might be relevant if you're advising a board.
That most of the deals are good.
And?
Some deals are bad.
Yeah, right. 25% of the transactions over the period, and we're dealing with 236 over this period. 25%, that's 50 plus deals, almost 60 deals, lost value on a combined basis, destroyed value. Right? I mean, that's to tell the board here. It's not, it's not a slam dunk that just because management comes with a deal that it's going to be great, A, for the shareholders of the acquirer necessarily, but B, that, over the long term for the shareholders diversified, it's going to create value. So this is both, it's a good news story in that the surplus is created on average, but it's a cautionary tale, which is to say it's really possible to do a deal that will be bad for everybody, right? All right, so let's see, is Carolyn here? Carolyn, so, but this study is not just about gains for the combined effect of acquiring target, right? What's it telling us about the division of those gains as between the shareholders of the acquirer and the shareholders of target? You need the mic.
Big picture, I think it was saying that the shareholders of the target benefited far more than the shareholders of the acquirer, or far more frequently.
Okay, right. If we look at, and again, let's just look at the total. the target returns here are on average 31.77. So almost 32% was the extent of the target shareholder gain. So if your firm was worth $100 million, then on average, the premium paid for your firm, the target, was roughly 32%. And how did the acquirers do on average over the portfolio? I'm sorry, on average over the period?
I guess almost 1%.
Yeah, the acquirers on average earned 1%. And again, what do the percent positives tell us about that?
That 50% of the time, the deals for the acquirer destroyed value.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's sort of a. Let me just drop a kind of a footnote here. I mean, we see that 95% of the time the deals created value for the target, and you wonder what happened to the other 5% of the time, right? The shareholders of the target do get to vote on the matter. It's a puzzle that they would vote for a deal where they lost value, but who knows what happens. But the point being, the more relevant fact here is roughly 50% of the time the shareholders of the acquirer, measured by the technology here, lose value. There's a negative return for them. And we will talk at much greater length as to what would motivate an acquirer. Why do we see these things occurring? But since presumably the management of the acquirer is trying to create value for the shareholders of the acquirer, and yet 50% of the time, at least here, value is destroyed for the shareholders of the acquirer. What's going on? All right, so Carolyn, the sample here is partitioned into 3 time periods. So what are the authors trying to illustrate by the partition in the data in this way?
I guess they're trying to track relative to like the regulations that were in place at the time and the trends in the market at the time. So in the first period, if it was cash tender offers, how that was affecting, I guess, both target and acquirer shareholders. And then as we regulated it more, what happened and what the value was created over time.
Okay, that's great. So basically, the premise of this study is that the allocation of gains between the acquirers and targets is not just kind of random, or it's not just, the atmosphere changes over time. Is that there is lawmaking of different types that intervene in the period that change the dynamics by which those gains are allocated. And to appreciate that is really important, right? So initially in the period before 68, by the way, was the adoption of the Williams Act. We'll discuss the Williams Act later, but the Williams Act is a part of the federal securities law, and I'll wait 1 second for the description. So in the initial period, a bidder was free to go to the market on a Thursday or Friday and say, the stock price of the target is $30 a share. I'll buy 100% of it for $35 a share. And I need to know by tomorrow morning or whenever. And so people making their individual choices would decide whether or not to tender to this offer. And if the bidder got more than 50% of the stock, then he or she could proceed with a merger at roughly the bid price and acquire the target. And in that regime, this is the period 763 to 668, the first column, we can see that the allocation of gains is between acquirer and target favor the acquirer. Target's got roughly 18%, and the acquirers on average gain 4% of their much higher market cap, right? The surplus in the period is the same. That doesn't change. It's just the allocation of the gains that changes mostly. Now, these were this era of the so-called Saturday night specials. And the claim was this was unfair to the shareholders of the target because they were pressured to tender, and there were structures that created that pressure, and we'll discuss those more later. But also, in effect, it's like you go to each shareholder and ask, what is your reservation price? And if the stock is trading at 30, if your reservation price, that is to say the price at which you'd be delighted to sell the stock and move on to the next stock, is 35, then of course you'll sell, right? That's roughly almost 20% increase in the price of your stock. Wow, overnight with zero risk. Sure, I'll take that and I'll invest in another stock, right? So in effect, each individual is making a kind of a solo decision, and so that favors the acquirer. If you get as 51% solo decision saying yes, then you are able to get the whole firm, do the merger at that price. So there isn't an opportunity for collective decision making by the shareholders. That's the point. There's no time. So part of what the Williams Act is enacted in 1968, and we will be discussing a lot about that, or you'll become very, very familiar with it. But part of what the Williams Act does, it adds time. And so the offer has to be open under the Williams Act in the early days for at least the 7 calendar days. You can't have a Saturday night special. You got to give the shareholders of the target at least 7 days to consider the offer. And there are certain other limits on the kind of offer that you can make. And as the amount of time for the shareholders of the target expands, then they're able to sort of get their act together collectively. Maybe a second bidder will come in. And so the point is that the legal change shifts the bargaining power between the shareholders of the target and the shareholders of the acquirer. That's the point. It changes the bargaining dynamic between the acquirer and the shareholders of target in a way that, as we see here, shifts more of the surplus to the shareholders of target at the expense of shareholders of the acquirer. Right? Stephen, when we went through that, the surplus remains roughly the same throughout the period. What we see is conditional on the change in the legal regime. The allocation of the surplus between acquirer and target shifts. And then this third period, in effect, is a period of growing empowerment of the board, the target board, to resist the takeover bid granted to the target board by the Delaware courts, poison pills and the like, which what? It changes again the bargaining between the shareholders, between the acquirer, which is making the bid, and the shareholders of the target, which again predictably results in a reallocation of the surplus, which is constant over the period. More of it is now going to the shareholders of target than acquirer, and indeed, if we look at the final column, the last row, so Carolyn, what's the punchline here of the post 81 period?
I guess the punchline is that it actually hurt acquirers to do takeover deals post 81.
That the gains of that the targets, at least on the initial cut, that the shareholders of the target got more than the total amount of the surplus, right? The acquirers, on average, were net losers. Okay, so here's where it becomes really fascinating. So, Carolyn, what is the dynamic that this study discusses which led to the capacity of the shareholders of the target to extract more than the surplus in the deal?
I guess you mean aside more than just like the defensive measures that the boards had?
More than, well, what was the mechanism? How did it happen? I've been vague about, the defensive measures, except what is the dynamic by which this study suggests that the targets were able to do better and indeed get more than the total amount of the initial gains?
I'm not sure if I have it, other than the fact that...
Take a look at figure 7.7, and maybe table 7.3.
So I think my takeaway from those 2 pages was about when competitive bidders would jump into the mix and effectively pump up the premium price to a point where the acquirers just outbid themselves until one of them lost the most.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what happened was, and it's kind of neat to see, as the legal regime, both the Williams Act and then the Delaware courts granting of the right to put in defensive measures came online, in effect, target boards were practically empowered to act as bargaining agents for the shareholders of Target, or simply there was more time and second bidders, even if the target board wasn't trying to create an auction, second bidders would show up. And all of a sudden, the competitive bidding, and we're going to discuss more about this later, the competitive bidding between first and second bidders, in effect, competed away the surplus, shifted the surplus from acquirer to target, and in some cases, the acquirers, because of the competitive bidding process, a successful acquirer ended up overbidding, meaning that the target got more than 100% of the merger gains. So my point is that this event study methodology shows us some very important institutional facts about the market, right? The bargaining arrangements, the dynamics between the acquirer and the target are significantly a function of the law, and if we change the law, we will change the bargaining endowments, as it were, relative to the acquirer and the target, and therefore we will change the distribution of gains between acquirer and target. Somebody wins, somebody loses. And an even more important insight, which is when we look at, again, figure 7.7 and 7.8, and then the table 7.3, we realize that in a multiple bidder scenario, targets did better than in a single bidder scenario. In a multiple bidder scenario, acquirers did worse than in a single bidder scenario. And so basically, if we look at, again, table 7.3, in the look at the far right-hand column, across the whole period where there were multiple bidders, acquirers, back up, the acquirers, multiple bidders over the whole period, the acquirer gains were negative 1.33%. So acquirers lost, in effect, where bidding was competitive. So this is an incredibly valuable lesson for today, because so much of deal structure today is an effort to reduce the chance that a second bidder will show up, because parties appreciate that multiple bidder engagements are great for the target, but not great for the acquirer. So therefore, when acquirers and targets enter into a, quote, friendly deal, you'll see an enormous amount of deal protection. And we will spend a lot of time in this course discussing that. But it stems from this fundamental insight, which is, why do we see all the deal protection? It's to make sure to try to minimize the chance that a second bidder shows up. Because when a second bidder shows up, from the first bidder's point of view, all hell breaks loose. And the allocation, the bargained for allocation of the surplus between me, the first bidder, and you, the target, gets blown up by this competitive bidding process, which, as we see here, will predictably lead to the target sweeping all the chips off the board, and the acquirer maybe getting something but maybe losing. So in a way, this study conveys critically important information for the deal lawyer, which is you've got to figure out, if you're going to do a friendly deal, how to make sure that your client wins. If it's the acquirer, your client wins. And so again, from and so this, when we discuss it, you'll see how far it goes. So, to what extent can a target board agree with the acquirer to deal protection that would keep away a potentially higher valuing bidder? In a way, giving away the shareholder chance to get a better bid? To what extent do we permit that as a matter of target board fiduciary duty? And then as we think about it, ex ante, the acquirer knows the risks of the acquirer knows how damaging it would be if a second bidder shows up. So maybe, unless the target board can give some sort of deal protection, the acquirer is not going to make the bid in the first place. So yeah, we're giving up the right of the, we're limiting the right of the target shareholders to get a better bid, but unless we do that, the acquirers who also look at these tables are going to say, hey, I'm not playing this game. And so kind of thinking through these rules in the light of the empirical evidence about what happens when there are multiple bidders, is part of the fun part of what we'll be doing. And then if you step back just one bit further, if you think if you're a diversified shareholder, do you really care about the allocation of gains as between bidder and acquirer? Isn't the only thing you care about that A, the transactions go forward, and B, that the ones that create surplus go forward? So maybe from the point of view of being the shareholder of a target, you hate deal protection, sort of. But then you sort of think, wait a minute, if I don't give it, then the acquirer doesn't show up. And then further, if you think about yourself as and so you come up with the idea of some legal rule, and then you step back further and you say, wait a minute, suppose I'm a diversified shareholder, and I don't care so much about allocation of gains, but I just want to make sure that the deals that create value go forward. How does that change your view about the legal rule that we ought to put in place with respect to deal protection? Anyway, so the point I want to make is this event study methodology, highly useful for lawyers. A, the single firm case where securities litigation will occur. But B, when it comes to us as deal lawyers, thinking about how to put together deals, and when it comes to us as maybe advisors to judges thinking about legal rules, being able to use this empirical evidence to inform our sense as to how the world works is of very significant value. Okay, so we'll stop here. Monday, we're going to do the last little piece of finance. I'm sure you're excited at that. It's on option pricing. And believe me, if you haven't considered this before, you'll be glad you did at some point. The thing to focus on is what are the elements that go into option pricing? How to understand in kind of a general way the elements that go into the Black-Scholes option pricing model, which the material describes. And then to begin to think, where do we see things in the transactional landscape that might be thought of as options, and therefore what kind of legal rules get framed when we think about these things as in the option framework. So let me give you a quick example to kind of motivate why we're doing this, right? So bidder and target enter into a merger agreement. Under the Delaware statute, and every statute, I trust you're familiar with this, the shareholders of the target always get to vote. So one way to think about that is the result of an agreement between the boards of the acquirer and the board of target is to give the shareholders of the target an option over the price that has been agreed in the merger agreement. So, what does that do? When we understand how options are priced, how does that affect our ideas about deal protection? That's kind of a motivating question as to why the option. One important M&A lawyer reason why the option pricing stuff will repay your effort to get a good intuition about. All right, so see you in a few days.
So if it's the case that the bidders, if there are multiple bidders, they always lose value from the data we've observed, then why are there
It's not always.
on average, and why would white knights agree? Why would companies agree to be white knights and take over them?
On average, on average, right? I'm not going to be the stupid bidder. Everybody thinks. They might think the market doesn't correctly judge the value to the acquirer of the target. So there's this goes to